I went to New Zealand in 2019, and before I went to their country, I made sure that I studied all of the major cities and landmarks, their culture, their food, different ways of lodging, and just kind of planned out my trip to make sure that I would know where I was going to go and how I could, travel alone as a solo woman and feel safe. I used an app on my phone called WikiLinks that you could search points of interest and then chart your path along the way. And it told me approximately, the kilometers from place to place. So, some people don't like to plan trips, but as an American who only has 2 weeks vacation, I found that I wanted to see as much of both the North and South Island as possible. So I used this app to plan my vacation kind of almost down by the hour. So I knew when I needed to leave a region so that I could go see another point of interest. I landed in Auckland, which is their capital, and made my way down through Wellington and then traveled the east coast of the South Island and then across the South Island the west coast of the South Island, and then I headed east to Dunedin. And I was trying to make it back up to Christchurch, and I ended up not being able to make it out that way. I took a flight in to the north and flew home out of the south because the Cook Strait is a major strait that you can take a ferry, but you have to drop your rental car and get a new rental car whenever you switch islands. So the history of the country was they were a British colony, and it was the 1700s when they were discovered by James Cook, late 1700s. And then the British found the Maori, the indigenous people living there. And as they were colonizing, they tried to establish a treaty to protect the Maori's lands. And of course, over the next 100 years, Maori were pushed out of their lands. So in 1975, there was a treaty enacted that would allow them to still consider land claims today. But mainly the island is now colonized by English and Scottish people. And then in the 1990s, the government wanted to build a labor force, and they encouraged Pacific Islander immigration, which actually diversified the population even more when there was an influx of the Asian immigrants in the 1990s. So after having planned everything out, I got there and I decided to have a little bit of fun. I went from place to place and took a lot of photos. And then I started to try the food. And, it's another country, so I didn't want to just order things that I knew were safe. I tried their white bait fish, which is actually a British snack. It's hundreds of tiny fish that are coated in egg batter and then deep fried. I did not try the Manuka honey because it was so expensive. Well, I tasted a stick of it, but it was so expensive. It was about $160 for less than 9 ounces. But it was believed to be a really beneficial thing to your health, kind of like how people like ginkgo biloba and vitamins. Manuka honey was a big thing for New Zealanders. They did have a wine country and chocolate manufacturing on their South Island, so I made sure to taste wine at 2 different wineries, and I bought a bottle and took it with me. And then the chocolate I bought and I took around with me on every hike. And I remember I shared my last piece of chocolate at the base of Franz Josef Glacier with a German couple because hiking and chocolate is so great. All of their meat was, every grocery store just said grass-fed. So I got, grass-fed lamb and grass-fed beef to eat, and I grilled it. Cookies was another big thing. So they seemed to have like a really big sweet tooth, I felt. I'm more of a savory person, but they had cookie bar, and they were gigantic cookies that, they sold to tourists. But It was a big industry for them. And they had this special hokey pokey ice cream, which had bits and pieces of that Manuka honeycomb into it, like with a vanilla. They also had this lemon and peora L&P soda, which was, again, very, very sweet. Lodging I found to be really fun after I planned my whole trip out. I wanted to make sure that I split up the way that I was staying throughout the country in both islands, between campsites to stay, at their lakes and their on their land. There are no large predators, so it's really safe. You don't have to worry about things like bears or cougars like you do in the U.S. So I stayed at camping. I did do a hostel for a couple days, and in the hostel, there was you just get a lot of different roommates. It was so packed. People were coming and going because tourism is such a huge industry for people in New Zealand. What I liked about the camping and the hostels was that they had these community kitchens. So my first night when I camped, I cooked by myself, and I didn't realize that you could go join this kitchen. We had several stove burners and several sinks, and everyone in the campground would go, and even in the hostels, everyone would go to the kitchen, and you'd all cook and you'd clean your dishes together and sit down and eat together. And when I was on the South Island, I actually, because there's one main road, there were several times where I would go into the kitchen and I would still come across people that I had seen the night before. So other tourists and German tourists or English tourists, which was really kind of fun. It's not something that you would really expect when you're traveling. So one thing that I did experience that I wasn't expecting was, and I hadn't found in my studies before I went, was that people actually do tour the country on bicycle. So they take their backpacking gear and they bike pack around the country. And I stayed in this one campground that was extremely wet. You can see my footprints as I go through the ground. It was soggy and I had to hang my tents up. But I remember I was camped next to a person who was bike packing, and he didn't have any food on his bike, so I had a bag of apples, and I remember giving him an apple, and it was, it made his day since we had all been so wet. Another thing about New Zealand that's really well known throughout the world is that the major director, Peter Jackson, he's from there, and he directed King Kong and then the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit movies. So there is a full movie set still intact where you can go in and out of the Hobbit homes in New Zealand. And there are waterfalls and blue water all throughout the country. I got to see on the west coast of the South Island, there are these rock formations that have come up on the coast. And they call those pancake rocks, and that was a huge destination. I was really excited. It's along the Tasman Sea. And then there's a lot of glaciers. Glaciers carved through the South Island and created sounds and fjordlands all throughout the region. And in this case, this is at the base of Franz Josef Glacier, and the river is white. And about a week or so after I had finalized my trip and returned to the U.S., the one main bridge, because they had a lot of single-lane bridges all throughout their country, and you had to follow traffic signals and make sure that you shared the road. You do drive on the left side of the road. It was interesting for the first few days until you get the hang of it. But this river, a few weeks after I returned to the U.S., was they had such a terrible storm that it washed out the bridge, and the country suffered because tourism was shut down for weeks until they were able to rebuild this bridge. I would stop on the side of the road and look at all kinds of mountains. You just couldn't go more than 3 minutes without seeing something beautiful. And these are all the things that I didn't have planned. One place that I had planned on stopping was this place called the Cardrona Bra Fence. And it is a place right along the side of the road where people stop and donate money to the Breast Cancer Foundation in New Zealand. And it's on the side of the road, and there's a whole Wikipedia page on it. They frequently have to clear the fence of all the braziers because tourists stop and do this. And I did. I stopped and participated. And at one point in my reading on this, I did discover that they had to move the fence from one side so that as people were becoming topless, it didn't disrupt traffic. And it used to be like right alongside the road, and they moved it a little bit further back. There's all kinds of water and pools, and the glaciers had carved out these large lakes. And here I am at the top of Queenstown with, you hike and you see so many people. I hiked about 13 miles out of the town that day, and this woman was up there with her dog, and the dog's name was Gypsy. And behind me is, down below, you can see Queenstown and Lake Wakatipu. And Lake Wakatipu, the Maori had folklore that a giant had come down from the mountains and taken this man's wife hostage. And the man set fire to the giant, and he was laid to rest in the lake. But he never completely died, so his heart would beat in the bottom of the lake. And this lake actually rises and falls every day for about 5 inches. I thought that was really interesting. And coming out of Queenstown, that was the area where I stayed in the hostel for a few days, there was a tour to the Fjordlands on the east coast of the South Island. And I got history from the tour guide that told me, during a time when they had suffered a lot of unemployment, the road through the Fjordland out of Queenstown actually employed many people. But they also sometimes referred to the death road because a lot of people died during the making of it. And there were 3 kind of valleys that you went through, and each valley offered different landscapes for you to look at. This was a big open field. And then these were the Mirror Lakes. And then this was Milford Sound. And Milford Sound is actually some people say it's one of the world wonders. And this body of water channels through all the fjords and out to the Tasman Sea. Other rock formations throughout the country, these were the Elephant Rocks. They are on the east coast of the South Island, just in between Dunedin and Christchurch. And there's a whole field of them, and you enter the field, and there's a bunch of sheep, and then you walk through the rock formation, and at the back of the field, there's a bunch of cattle. Also on the east coast of the South Island are the Meraki Rocks, and these are rock formations that have washed up to the coastline that are perfectly cylindrical. Just balls. More Elephant Rocks. Birds were really common. So, like as I mentioned, there wasn't any large predators, but they did have kiwis, and kiwis were difficult to come by. They were very elusive, and I thought I had seen one when I was camping on the Tasman Sea, coast of the Tasman Sea, but it ended up that one of the people in a gift shop had told me, she said, well, what did it look like and what time of day was it? And she said, no, you didn't see a kiwi, you have seen a wika. And wikas are a little bit bigger and their feathers are slightly different, but a lot of people mistake wikas for kiwis. I did try to see some kiwis, but it was too expensive. And so I just went to the country and never saw one. They do have large meat-eating parrots called kias. So that's about the most vicious predator they have is a giant bird. They do have a lot of spiders too. Sheep. There's probably more sheep in the country than there are than people. So there's a lot of wool, and you can eat a lot of sheep and lamb. I did make sure that before I went, I wanted to go see an art museum, and I got to see some of their, indigenous artwork. And then they also had some Monet and Picasso and a hokusai of the waves. In the museum that I went to, I got to see history on how the European explorers, had settled there and attempted to colonize, and they had a huge industry of seals and whaling, and Christchurch is still a large whaling community. I got to see the way that the Maori had lived in huts and fished on the lakes. There was a period of time, when they were trying to get those treaties established and protect their land, where there was war between the Maori and the people trying to colonize. There was also prohibition, so they went through that. On my last day, I did stop by a seaside graveyard just to see some of the people's names who had passed and what their graveyards were like. I did stop in a botanic garden in Dunedin to look at all of the flora to see what kind of plants they had. Their country was really covered in ferns, lots of ferns and tropical plants. It's not all that unlike Oregon, though, when it comes to rain, and we're on the same latitude. Lots of flowers, giant leaves. And then when I returned home, as I mentioned, there was the bridge washout, and I was sad to hear that they also had suffered the mass shooting in Christchurch at the mosque. But my takeaway, after being so heartbroken for them, is my biggest takeaway after visiting New Zealand as a country was how peaceful of a nation they really are, how much they pride themselves in education and being environmentally sound, real organic style gardening. I remember when I went through customs, they checked my tent. You're not allowed to bring in any live species, dirt, plants, or anything, or take any fruits or vegetables out, because they want to make sure that no invasive species attack, the plant life or the animal life on their island. So, while everyone had gone through quite a bit of pain during the pandemic, it was nice to hear that, New Zealand was doing quite well, because, again, they were so strict on locking their country down and protecting their people, especially after, the tragedies that they experienced with the washout on the bridge, attacking their tourism, and then the mass shootings. I went alone, and I would actually, with one friend, but I left my family here. I would love to go back to New Zealand and take my family so that they could experience what I saw. But I also kept a journal and documented my trip pretty well and researched, like I said, before I went. And I thought that made it a really great experience. I highly recommend that anyone research before they go. The next place I do plan on going is Iceland, and I am currently in the process of researching that country. So hopefully I can make a deck like this again in the future. Thank you.